Alina trusted him. She called him Dad. To the outside world, Mr. Tayo was the perfect father, the kind of man who wore a smile that could light up a room. But behind that smile was a monster only Alina could see. When she was 9 years old, her life began to fall apart. Back then, Alina was just a normal kid who loved drawing, dancing in the rain, and pretending her bed was a castle. Her father was her hero. She would watch him work on his computer, mesmerized by the colorful designs on his screen, thinking he was creating something magical. He always made time for her, and she believed in him completely. She remembered one sunny afternoon when they built a birdhouse together in the backyard. Her father handed her the paintbrush and told her she could choose the colors. "Yellow," she said excitedly, "because it looks like sunshine." When her hand slipped, leaving a streak of paint on his shirt, she froze, but he had only laughed. "Mistakes are part of making something beautiful," he said, ruffling her hair. In that moment, she admired him so much. But heroes, Alina would learn, sometimes wore masks. One quiet evening, Alina sat cross-legged on her bed, sketching a picture of her family. Her father entered her room, his usual gentle smile softening his face. It was a smile that always made her feel safe. A smile that she trusted. "Alina," he said, kneeling beside her, "I want to teach you something special, just for us. It'll be our little secret." To her 9-year-old mind, those words felt like a gift, a promise of something unique and precious. She nodded eagerly, thinking she was about to share in some magical father-daughter bond. But that night, her life changed forever. It started innocently, or at least that's what Alina told herself. But soon her father's actions became something she couldn't understand. When he whispered, "This is how fathers make their daughters special," her heart sank. Even though she didn't fully grasp the meaning of his words, she froze, clutching the edge of her bedsheet. Her small fingers gripped it as if it could shield her. The pain wasn't just physical, it was something deeper, something that tore at her sense of safety and trust. "Daddy, please," she begged through tears, her voice trembling. "It hurts. I don't like it." But he didn't stop. When he finally left her room, Alina curled into a ball, hugging her stuffed rabbit to her chest. She cried until her throat ached and her eyes burned. She whispered to the rabbit, "Why does love hurt so much? I just want it to stop." The next morning, she wanted to tell someone. She thought about running to her mother, but her father's words haunted her. "If you tell anyone, they'll take you away. Do you want to lose your family?" Alina loved her mother. She loved her home. The thought of being taken away terrified her, so she stayed silent. Days turned into weeks. Every time her mother came home, Alina's chest filled with desperate hope. Maybe today she would finally tell her. Maybe her mom would hold her and tell her everything would be okay. But as soon as her mother walked through the door, Alina would see the exhaustion in her eyes, the way she slumped into a chair with a sigh. And she'd hesitate. Her mother's shop was her world, and that world spilled into their home. The dining table was always covered with stacks of papers, coins, and notes. Her mother's glasses perched precariously on her nose as she calculated profits late into the night. One evening, Alina stood in the doorway, clutching her stuffed rabbit. Her tiny fingers tightened around its ears as she watched her mother count money, her brows furrowed in concentration. Alina's heart pounded. She took a step forward, her voice barely a whisper. "Mama," she said softly, her throat tightening. "Can I talk to you?" Her mother didn't look up. "Not now, Alina. I'm busy." "But it's really important," Alina pleaded, her voice trembling. Her mother sighed, setting down her pen, and finally glanced at her. "Alina, go do your homework. I worked so hard to give you this life. Don't bother me with your little problems." Her mother's words hit her like a slap. Tears welled up in Alina's eyes, but she forced herself to swallow them down. She wanted to scream, to grab her mother's hands and make her listen. Instead, she nodded and whispered, "Okay, Mama," before turning and walking away. That night, the familiar sound of her father's footsteps echoed in the hallway. Alina's heart raced, her breath hitching. She tried locking the door, but he forced it open. She tried pretending to be asleep, but he shook her awake. She even hid under the bed once, but he simply pulled her out. "Don't fight it, Alina," he said softly, his voice as smooth as honey. "This is how I show you that I love you." Love. That word twisted in her mind, transforming into something monstrous. She wanted to scream, to run, but she couldn't. Her body froze every time, trapped in a cycle of fear and shame. The next morning, Alina stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. She saw someone unrecognizable, someone dirty, someone broken. She scrubbed her face with water, as if washing away the pain could make her whole again. At breakfast, her mother noticed the dark circles under her eyes. "Alina, what's wrong?" she asked casually, pouring tea into her cup. Alina opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She wanted to tell her, but what was the point? Her mother wouldn't listen. Outside of her home, the world carried on as if nothing had happened. Teachers praised her for being quiet and obedient. "Such a good girl," they said, while Alina sat at her desk with her hands trembling under the table. She envied her classmates, their laughter, their carefree joy. She hated how free they were. One day, the weight of it all became too much. Alina stood in the living room watching her mother at the dining table. Her legs felt weak, her hands clammy. "Mama," she said, her voice barely audible. "Yes, Alina," her mother replied without looking up, her pen scratching against the paper. "It's about Daddy," Alina began, her voice shaking. He does things to me when you're not here." Her mother's pen stopped mid-stroke. For a brief moment, Alina thought she had finally been heard, but her mother sighed and pinched the bridge of her nose. "Alina, don't start with your stories again. Your father worked so hard for this family. Stop trying to cause trouble." "But Mama, it hurts," Alina cried out, her voice breaking. "I don't want to hear it," her mother shouted, slamming her hand on the table. The sound made Alina flinch. "I don't have time for your nonsense. Go to your room." Alina stood frozen, tears streaming down her face. She waited, hoping her mother would notice, hoping she would see her pain. But her mother didn't look up. She turned back to her ledger, her focus shifting as though Alina wasn't even there. Alina turned and walked away, her heart shattering into a million pieces. She held her stuffed rabbit tightly, her tiny hands trembling. In her room, she curled up on her bed, staring at the ceiling. She whispered to herself, "Why doesn't anyone see me? Why doesn't anyone care?" The silence in the house was deafening, a weight pressing down on her chest. After that, she stopped trying to tell her mother. What was the point? Her mother wouldn't believe her. No one would. She became like a ghost in her own house, drifting silently from room to room, avoiding them both as much as she could. But he didn't stop, and each time he left her room, it felt like he had taken another piece of her with him. One evening, as she sat on the staircase crying quietly, footsteps sounded behind her. Her body froze, expecting it to be him, but it wasn't. It was her mother. "Alina," her mother said, her voice softer than usual. "Why are you crying?" For a moment, Alina considered telling her. The words hovered on the edge of her lips, ready to spill out. But then she remembered all the times her mother hadn't listened, all the times she dismissed her, accusing her of making things up. "It's nothing," Alina whispered, quickly wiping her tears away. Her mother studied her for a moment, concern softening her features. "You've been acting strange lately. Is there something you're not telling me?" Alina shook her head, her heart racing. She couldn't tell her. Not again. That night, everything changed. For the first time, her mother came home early, and what she saw shattered her world. The evening had started like any other. Her mother returned from her shop earlier than usual, arms laden with fabric samples and receipts. Alina lay on her bed, staring at the ceiling, numb to everything around her. The sound of the front door opening and her mother's familiar footsteps echoed through the house. Alina's heart sank. She knew he was still there. Silently, she prayed he would leave her alone tonight. But prayers had never worked before. His voice came from downstairs, calm and friendly as if nothing bad had happened just moments ago. "You're home early," he said, his tone filled with fake kindness. "Yes," she replied, sounding distracted. "The shop was slow, so I closed early." Upstairs, Alina stayed completely still, listening to their casual talk. Maybe tonight would be different. Maybe he wouldn't come upstairs. But as her mother unpacked her bags in the kitchen, she heard the sound she feared most, his footsteps on the stairs. Her chest tightened with fear. Not again. He walked into her room without knocking, his face dark and threatening. "You know the rule," he said coldly, shutting the door behind him. Alina backed into the corner of her room, shaking. Her voice was soft, barely a whisper. "Please," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "Not tonight." He stepped closer, but before he could do anything, the door suddenly flew open. "Eris!" her mother's voice roared through the room. Both of them froze. Alina had never heard her mother speak like that before, so full of anger and shock, as if her whole world had fallen apart. Her mother's eyes moved between them, seeing Alina's tear-covered face and his guilty look. It didn't take long for her to understand. "What are you doing?" she screamed, her voice shaking with anger and disbelief. He tried to speak, his words stumbling out, but there was nothing he could say. No excuse would ever make this right. Instead of apologizing, he turned his anger on her. "You don't understand," he shouted, his face red with rage. "You're never here. You're always at that shop, leaving me alone to handle everything. What else was I supposed to do?" His words were poison, filling the room. Her mother's face changed, a mix of horror and guilt Alina had never seen before. She stepped back, holding on to the doorframe for support. You're blaming me?" she asked, her voice shaking as if it might break. "Yes," he yelled, his voice growing louder. "You've been gone for years. You don't care about this family. All you care about is money." Alina watched her mother's face crumble under his words. For a moment, she thought her mother might believe him, but then her mother's eyes turned to her, curled up in the corner, scared, silently begging for help. And her mother fought. With a loud scream, her mother rushed at him, yelling words Alina couldn't make out through the chaos. He tried to push her away, but she held on with all her strength. Finally, she managed to shove him out of the room and slam the door, locking it behind her. Breathing hard, her mother fell to the floor next to Alina and wrapped her arms around her. For the first time, she really looked at her daughter, not as the quiet, obedient child she thought she knew, but as the scared, broken girl she had failed to protect. "Why didn't you tell me?" her mother cried, her tears falling onto Alina's hair. "I did," Alina whispered, her voice barely audible. "You didn't listen." Her mother's sobs grew louder, full of pain and regret. "I'm so sorry, Alina. I'm so sorry I didn't see it sooner." The next morning, the police arrived at their house. Alina's mother had called them in the middle of the night, determined not to let him stay under their roof for even another moment. But when the officers came to arrest him, he was already gone. He had vanished, leaving behind only fear and a sense of brokenness. For weeks, Alina and her mother lived in constant dread, always watching, always waiting for the moment he might return. Her mother closed her shop and stayed home with Alina, desperate to make up for the years she had ignored her daughter's cries for help. She tried everything to rebuild their lives, but the guilt never truly left her, and neither did the shadow of fear he had cast over them.